Psychological truth is really, really important to me. So I'm very interested in imposter phenomenon. We all deal with this thing called imposter phenomenon. My friend from the medical field defined it, and then we started looking at it, and I'm like, okay, well, that's really interesting. So I think the imposter phenomenon, when you self-assess as much less than you are, regardless of clear evidence to the contrary, that the veil is someday going to fall and everyone's going to know that you're a fake. And that's why we call it imposter phenomenon. And so some people think imposter phenomenon is just something that everyone deals with as they're starting out in a career. And that may very well be true. But for some people, it continues and continues. So the initial research was done by two psychologists who saw really, really high achieving women thinking of themselves as so much less. And yet, research that has followed that has found that it affects everyone. But what's really interesting is that women experience imposter phenomenon and they shrink, and men experience imposter phenomenon, and this is just generalized, of course, and they fake it till they make it. And so while everyone experiences it, response is very different. And so I'm interested in imposter phenomenon because it affects me and it affects my friends. But there's something when I've looked at church history that has always just really annoyed me. Like there are these women who are saying these amazing things and doing amazing things, and they're like, but I'm just a woman, you really shouldn't listen to me. Or they'll be like, oh, this is coming from the mouth of, like, I'm just acting like Balaam's donkey. Like, if God can speak through a donkey, then God can speak through to a woman. And that just really, really annoys me. Like, these women, they impacted the world of Christianity. Like, they made a difference. And yet they're still speaking of themselves that way. Why would they do that? And if you look at it on the outside, it's like these women who are clearly doing something significant talking about themselves as so insignificant. So what is that? And what they were doing was just agreeing with society told them to be, and it is often called humility. And so when you look at a lot of definitions of humility, a lot of people define humility from a place of privilege. If you're from a place of privilege, you need to bring yourself down a little bit. But when you're not from a place of privilege, society has already put you down. And if society has already put you down, then how do you even understand humility? So I think there's a lot of bad definitions of humility kind of out there. And even historical definitions do often concentrate on self-abasement. So even if you're looking at people like Aquinas or other great writers who lived very, very simple lives, they were still male and white, most of the ones that we read. And so they're still coming from a place of privilege. So I was looking at what psychological research said about imposter phenomenon, what these women did, but then I wanted to add into a kind of more practical idea of hierarchical Christian contexts. Because while I'm in a denomination in a context that would be defined as soft complementarian, there's still this hierarchical idea of male over female, at least to a certain degree. A lot of hierarchical Christian contexts will not allow women to preach to men and women. And so if you're a person like, say you're me, and you know that you can do this, and you believe that, you believe with, and maybe this is just too evangelical, you believe with all your heart, it's your call. Like these terms aren't always used everywhere, but like, you're like, I'm called to do that. And then, but the authority who gives you the ability to do so is saying no. It seems that could easily engender imposter phenomenon where you're like, okay, I'm really just nothing. And if imposter phenomenon in women causes women to shrink back, it just made me think about how many voices were probably lost throughout history. So if we can read a Teresa of Avila or a Catherine Zell or some even like Pentecostal women put themselves down because it's only Holy Spirit who speaks anyway. Mary McClintock Fulkerson looked at them and was just like, well, that's really interesting. Why do they say that about themselves? But that's what gives them power. Catherine Zell said, I waited for all the men to speak. And then since they didn't speak, I just had to. So there's a stereotype. So you have stereotype threat. You're supposed to be this way. And then these women agreed with the stereotype. Yes, I'm nothing. I'm just a woman. And yet they displayed stereotype incongruence in their ability to speak, their writing of pamphlets, they're getting their voice out into the world. A researcher who's looking at people of color in STEM contexts they were in places where people of color often were not. And basically what she found was they had to engage in something she called stereotype management. So she coined this word, where they had to change themselves in order to fit into the environment. And so there was a gentleman that she writes of that was part of the Latin caucus. And one of his professors said, you need to basically divorce yourself from your home and from your people in order to succeed here. And so he did. He quit the Latin caucus. He changed his address to a P.O. box because he was in the middle of a Latin American community and didn't want to have that address anymore. And so that stereotype management, he had to change himself in order to move forward. And stereotype management causes psychological distress. Imposter phenomenon is correlated with a whole bunch of other issues. Like it's correlated with anxiety, depression, low self-efficacy. Like it's a whole long list, so it's not good. And yet, when I look at women, they've engaged in it throughout the centuries. And they've continued to have to do this. And so I kind of put that together with looking at humility. So humility is often defined as self-abasement, and yet there's often other nuances to it. And you can't talk about humility without talking about magnanimity. So humility is understanding yourself as just a human. But magnanimity is also understanding your true greatness. And so some of the philosophical greats really put those two together, and you really can't think about them otherwise. Teresa of Avila, when she defined humility, she said, I have humility before God, which is like, I am completely dependent on God. And I have nothing except that God would give it to me. And so the only thing that I have is because God has given me gifts. And so these gifts, then if you move to magnanimity, are also my greatness. And so she's like, humility before God is limitless. Like there's no limit to that. I will always be just an abject human. But then she said, humility before others is limited. Because she's an expert on prayer. No matter who's talking to her, she doesn't necessarily have to take everything that they're saying about prayer. And so she needs to understand that in her development and in her richness, God has given her this greatness. Because women tend to attribute success to chance, and failure they'll internalize and say, oh my gosh, that's because I'm awful. Like that's what women with imposter phenomenon do. And men do the opposite. They'll attribute success to themselves. And again, these are just general tendencies. It's certainly not the whole world. They'll attribute success to themselves and say, I did a good job. And failure to, it was just an accident. And so women with imposter phenomenon are neither humble nor magnanimous because they don't understand the truth. They might sound humble. And when you look at these women, they'll say, oh, I'm just a woman. So they'll sound humble. That's how you make friends sometimes. Because if they really knew how great you were, they might be intimidated and they might not want to be with you. So that seems like they're using that as a strategy to gain voice. It's the only way they got it.